All right, we're back in the FITSNews studio, our first show of 2023. I've got a 2022 cigar in my pocket, though, that I smoked on New Year's Eve. That's still got me a little lightheaded, folks. Hadn't had a cigar in years, but it's inspired me. I'm going to get ranty in this show, folks. Some real nut shots coming up. What are we talking about? Drama in D.C. People, an election for Speaker of the U.S. House, which I'm going to explain to you, means nothing. Absolutely nothing. Republicans, Democrats, we're going to talk about how it's the same or different sides of the same coin. Sound and fury signifying nothing. We're also going to talk about redistricting in South Carolina. The boundaries, political boundaries in South Carolina have come under scrutiny. A key federal ruling was issued this week in connection with those boundaries. We're going to get into that. Abortion, a huge ruling from the South Carolina Supreme Court. We're going to discuss that. And last but not least, we're going to dig into Cheer Incorporated, folks. This story continues to escalate, at least on our coverage. Where's the mainstream press on it? Who knows, man? I'm hearing crickets around the studio as we raise that question. But we're going to talk about the latest developments in Cheer Inc. And actually, we're going to highlight one national reporter who is doing the job. All that and much more coming your way on the Week in Review. So I always like how we talk about Republicans and Democrats. We've been talking about these parties for decades, right? Right. And we talk about these parties as if there's any real difference between them when it comes to the issues that really matter or should really matter. If you're a citizen, if you're a taxpayer, if you're a consumer here in the United States of America. And I want to say a couple things here because, my news outlet for years has been, it started as a political site. FITSNews has been a political site. We've done a lot of true crime in recent years. We've done a lot of justice work in recent years. But at its core, FITSNews was a political site, which broke down the purported differences between these parties, between candidates within these parties. But increasingly, and again, I've been doing this for 2 decades now, there's no difference. This is the same coin. You flip it heads, you flip it tails, you get the same thing. People aren't battling for control. They are battling for who just grips the rudder. That's it. The rudder doesn't change direction. It's stuck. The ratchet doesn't move but one way. It is a definitional one-way ratchet. And so there's not an argument over, fiscal conservative versus fiscal liberal. No. There's an argument over who's holding on to the rudder, the stuck rudder that's literally driving this republic off a cliff. I did a story shortly after Christmas. I think it was the day after Christmas. And it was on the latest omnibus bill, $1.7 trillion, people. $1.7 trillion, just to fund part of the government for the next 10 months. Doesn't address entitlements, doesn't address interest payments on the national debt, which, by the way, are approaching $500 billion a year. Within a decade, there will be $1 trillion a year interest payments just on the national debt. Again, we used to talk about the national debt. Oh, we'll worry about that later. We don't have to worry about that now. It's somebody else's problem. But $1 trillion a year just to pay the effing interest on the debt? There's a great column, by the way, on FITSNews this week by our guest columnist, Prelo Alexander, which addresses that. If you haven't seen that column, check it out. But he offers up some harsh, if you will, but frankly, some common sense suggestions that cut to the very heart of what's wrong with this country. And what's wrong with this country is that as individuals, as a culture, and sure as hell as a government, we've got this entitlement problem. We think it is owed to us. And not only do we think it's owed to us, we think we don't have to ever pay it back because that's somebody else's problem. Well, guess what? I'm in the first generation where it is my problem. Dylan Nolan, our director of special projects, behind the camera, 23 years old next week. Sorry, dude. Good luck getting that Social Security check, bro. My 7 kids. I mean, what kind of generation does this to its children? To its future. But anyway, Republicans, and again, I'm going to do my baby quotes here because I live in South Carolina, by the way, a state where the Republican-controlled General Assembly has been ranked the most liberal GOP legislature in the country 3 years running. And folks, they're going to make it 4 this year. Guarantee ya. Anyway, Republicans in Washington, D.C. this year, they took control of the House of Representatives very narrowly. They've got 222 votes, I believe, just over the 218 required for a majority. But they're trying to elect a speaker, a leader. And apparently in Washington, nothing can happen in the Congress until the House elects a speaker. So no bills can be discussed. In fact, they don't even swear in the new members, one of whom, Russell Fry, coming from the 7th District here in South Carolina, not even sworn in yet, doesn't get an office budget yet because, again, they haven't picked a leader. And we're taping this on a Friday afternoon. There have been over a dozen votes at this point in an attempt to get a speaker. And the media has portrayed this as you've got basically 20. I think that number has since dropped to about 15. But you've got a handful, more than a dozen, ultra-conservative, MAGA conservative, whatever you want to call them, Republicans who simply will not vote for Kevin McCarthy, who is the speaker nominee. He's the former House Minority Leader, guy who's been up there forever, California moderate. Again, I don't like or dislike him. I don't know enough about him. But the lawmakers who oppose him do not believe he is adequately committed to getting serious about reducing those deficits, reducing that debt. And in fact, one of them is a South Carolina lawmaker, Ralph Norman. Now, he flipped at the very last minute on I believe it was the 11th or the 12th vote for McCarthy and said he would now support his speakership. But originally, Norman was one of the first 5 people to come out against him, said, I'm not going to support him because he doesn't, he's not serious about reducing the deficit, eliminating deficits and reducing the debt. He's not serious about that. I won't support him. I'm not a Ralph Norman fan, by the way. In fact, I like Nancy Mace. I think Nancy Mace is doing good things. But other than her, I really can't think of anybody in this delegation that blows my skirt up. I mean, they all, very status quo, very pro-establishment. Norman, one of the worst crony capitalists you can imagine. He was mixed up in this botched Panthers deal up there in York County that my news outlet has focused on, exposing that crony capitalist deal. He stood to benefit richly from that agreement. But he's got a point on this. And again, I don't know the particulars of the negotiations that made him flip from being opposed to Kevin McCarthy to supporting him. But guys, we got to start talking about this because that road that we've been kicking the can down for literally decades, we are at that brick wall. It is literally staring us right in the face. The can no longer be kicked. Again, when that interest on a debt is consuming, again, by the end of the decade, over $1 trillion a year, what do you do? And I want to back this tape up a little bit because so many people in this current climate are going to say, oh, well, it's Joe Biden's fault. First of all, Joe Biden doesn't know where the hell he is. Okay, well, let's just be honest. It's whoever the teleprompter loader for Joe Biden, it's that person's fault. No. Donald Trump is his fault too. Again, right before he left office, right before everything went nuts on January 6th, he signed a bill which he himself called a disgrace. But he signed it. Another massive COVID stimulus. And again, these things were Christmas trees. People got, just like that omnibus, that $1.7 trillion bill I was telling you about earlier, these things were just giveaways to bureaucracies, to special interests, to pet projects in lawmakers' districts. Same thing. And again, doesn't matter whether it's Republicans, doesn't matter whether it's Democrats, they're all doing it. None of them care about routing that kind of relief to where it actually will do some difference, which is small businesses, sole proprietorships, individual taxpayers. No. It's all about the corporate giveaways, the special interest giveaways, pork infrastructure projects, BS in their districts that they can put their names on. Again, Republican, Democrat, there is no difference. And I'm gonna put it to you this way. We will never get serious about the issue of the damning impact of our debt and deficits in this country. We will never get serious about it within the construct of the two-party state. Won't happen. Won't happen. It's that old adage about once they realize they can get reelected by giving money away out of the treasury, country goes bankrupt. Democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. Some Scottish minister said that. Look it up. Anyway, the impact of this on South Carolina, we'll have to see. Ralph Norman, I think some people have suggested he may face a challenger in a Republican primary because of his initial opposition to Kevin McCarthy. We'll see. former chief of staff in the White House, Mick Mulvaney, organizing those efforts. Mulvaney actually held that seat before Ralph Norman. Mulvaney, not a Trump fan, not a Ralph Norman fan. But also, let's not forget, Trump tried to get these guys to switch to McCarthy several days ago. They wouldn't do it. They ignored him, which is another sign of Trump's weakened clout within the Republican Party, which I believe could be very interesting come 2024 when he starts coming to South Carolina again, asking for votes in the first in the South presidential primary. It'll be very interesting to see if that Trump machine in South Carolina. You can debate all you want how much of the GOP establishment Trump controlled nationally, but there was never any doubt he owned the SCGOP. Literally said jump. SCGOP chair Drew McKessick said how high. Governor Henry McMaster said how high. Owned the establishment of the Republican Party here in South Carolina. So is that still going to be the case? I mean, you can only call the cavalry so many times, and then they don't come when people say, wait a minute, you got no cavalry. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. But again, this news outlet started as a political website, but this is so much bigger than politics, people. This is literally the future of the republic, the viability of this republic moving forward, the full faith and credit of the United States government. Does it mean anything? Or is it just Bitcoin in the Bahamas, where these kids down there blowing billions of dollars? I mean, is that what we've become? Or is it even worse than that? I don't know. But I'll tell you what, we got to find out soon, and we will never find out again if we are relying on Republicans and Democrats to solve it. Because whether it's been all Republicans, all Democrats, part Republicans, part Democrats, there has been no formulation of that equation that has gotten us anywhere near fiscal sanity, fiscal discipline, and the sort of course we need to chart a responsible way forward for this republic. It's simply non-existent. So again, count on Fitz. You won't hear that from the mainstream press. They love to do the two-party thing. Let's pit red team, blue team, hardcore right, ultra MAGA, ultra progressive, AOC versus whoever. Don't fall for it, people. They're all bankrupting your country. All right, so I'll try not to be so dramatic in this segment, but we do want to talk about one of the congressional districts that we referenced in this last segment. Obviously, South Carolina has 7 of them, 6 of them Republican controlled. But again, as we just mentioned, what's that worth? Anyway, I just told you what it's worth. But let's talk about these lines. The district lines in South Carolina are redrawn every 10 years, as they are in every state, based on population, based on the census, based on where people have moved. So there's always going to be 435 seats in the U.S. Congress, but where those seats are, what state, and frankly, where the seats are within the state is determined on, again, population, where people come, where people go. And so in South Carolina, those seats were redrawn ahead of the 2022 elections based on 2020 census data, which, by the way, was late. Government was late getting that data because of COVID. But here's the deal. State lawmakers redrew the districts in a way that, according to a U.S. District Court ruling that was issued just this week on Friday, violated the Equal Voting Rights Act, violated equal protection under the law, the 14th Amendment, based on the racially motivated gerrymandering of 30,000 voters out of Charleston County from District 1 into District 6. Now, we looked at District 1 extensively in the 2022 election. That district was competitive in 2018. It was competitive in 2020. In fact, a Democrat won this district in 2018. Joe Cunningham went on to get his butt stomped in the governor's race this past year. But he won that congressional seat in 2018, a big upset. It was the first time in nearly 40 years that seat had gone Democrat. And in 2020, Cunningham narrowly lost to Nancy Mace. Now, Mace was in a lot of trouble when she was running for re-election. She won in 2020 narrowly. She upset Donald Trump literally her first day on the job in 2021. Had a huge, Trump endorsed her opponent. There was a huge chunk of the Republican electorate that literally hated her. But Mace did 2 things. Number 1, she outperformed expectations in a primary victory. And then she went on double-digit landslide, won by 14% of the vote over a very credible, very well-funded Democratic opponent. So this district was not competitive. Again, 14%, that's not competitive, folks. That's a curb stomping. But according to this district court ruling, The lines of that district were not fairly drawn, and again, they were unfairly drawn based on racial considerations. Now, in years past, South Carolina, these rulings, you wouldn't have seen a court ruling like this because previously South Carolina had to get pre-clearance on its congressional boundaries from the federal government. That was due to its, again, long legacy of disenfranchising black voters, and that was a standard that I believe was appropriate to remain in place until the state proved that it could draw districts that weren't racially motivated. Now, in 2013, a Supreme Court case, a ruling was issued which removed that pre-clearance requirement. So this was the first time in decades that South Carolina was able to draw its own lines without the federal government giving a stamp of approval on the front end. But that doesn't mean that the court doesn't get to assess challenges on the back end, which is what they've done and what they did this week with the ruling, arguing that the lines of District 1, again, violated that equal protection amendment to the Constitution, violated that right to vote on the behalf of the folks that were moved. Now, what does this mean politically? Honestly, not much. This issue now goes back to the South Carolina General Assembly. They have until March to redraw that district in a way that will pass muster with the federal courts with that equal protection standard. So we will see what they do. They've got, again, 3 months to get that job done. But still, you can push the margins a little one way, push them the other way. Again, this is a staunchly Republican district, 14-point shellacking in the last election by Nancy Mace over her well-funded Democratic opponent. So I don't see this impacting races moving forward, but it is a very important notice from the federal government that South Carolina's district lines will be subject to the same level of scrutiny that they have in the past, this time just not on the front, but on the back end. And I think that's a good thing because, again, non-competitive elections, if you read this news outlet, we have said for years that non-competitive elections are a problem because if elections aren't competitive, guess what? Elected officials aren't accountable, and it's harder to hold them accountable. And as I pointed out in this last election, 6 out of 10 races for the South Carolina House of Representatives in November, there was no race. There was no race because the elected officials were running unopposed. That's not healthy for democracy. That's not healthy for accountability. And if you're a taxpayer and a citizen of South Carolina expecting a government to be fair and work for you, it's not healthy for you either. So again, count on FITSNews to keep close tabs on all these political boundary battles because they matter to your bottom line. So big week on the abortion issue in South Carolina. Months after temporarily enjoining the enforcement of the heartbeat bill, which was passed in 2021 and which blocks most abortions in South Carolina after a fetal heartbeat is detected. Months after enjoining the enforcement of that bill, the South Carolina Supreme Court this week struck it down. A major blow to pro-lifers and a major shot across the bow of the South Carolina General Assembly, which has doubled down on the heartbeat bill with the passage of even more restrictive abortion regulation in the past session. Now, this news outlet has looked at this issue from multiple perspectives. We provided coverage at every step of the way, but at no point in that coverage did I ever imagine that the justices of the South Carolina Supreme Court would pull a privacy right out of the state constitution based on this particular legal challenge. I thought this challenge had no chance of passing. I thought this was a guaranteed 3-2 defeat for the Planned Parenthood of the South Atlantic region, which is the entity which challenged it. I was wrong. It was 3-2 the other way. Chief Justice Don Beatty, Associate Justice Kay Hearn, and Associate Justice John Few all agreed that the South Carolina Constitution's privacy provision, which is basically an extension of the U.S. Fourth Amendment regarding unlawful searches and seizures, according to them, that extends over the right to life. That trumps the right to life of a viable heartbeat-enabled fetus. So, again, this ruling came out of left field. It was a shock, again, not only to the General Assembly. Attorney General Alan Wilson issued a statement indicating his surprise at the ruling. And, of course, Governor Henry McMaster, who signed this bill into law back in February of 2021. Now, it's interesting. This bill was enjoined federally back in 2021, right when it was passed. And it did not become the law of the state until the U.S. Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. Now, at that point, existing state law becomes the law. And so it was temporarily in effect. But after lawmakers went back to the abortion issue, tried to pass, again, as I mentioned, even tougher legislation, the Supreme Court stepped in, blocked the heartbeat bill, and now has completely struck that bill down. Does this matter? What will be the future path of this issue legislatively? Again, we don't know. Obviously, it matters greatly because now, essentially, abortion on demand back on the table in South Carolina. The heartbeat bill completely struck down because lawmakers, again, pulled this privacy provision out of the state constitution. As I've said before, I'm a pro-lifer. I don't think that this ruling was accurate. I don't think it's consistent. I think that that privacy provision very clearly flows from the Fourth Amendment, which has nothing to do with abortion, nothing to do with the right to life. I think the constitutional life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, I think that's where you need to start on this issue. But again, this news outlet is here to host a conversation. That's why from the very beginning of this issue, we've covered it down the middle. We've offered everyone with a take, everyone with a perspective. In fact, we've got a letter writer that wrote this morning telling me that she'd spent 2 years of her life hosting and feeding babies, and that she's got a right to speak on it that I don't. And you know what? I agree with her. And we let those perspectives out because, again, that's what we're here for at FITSNews, that marketplace of ideas where everybody's perspective on every issue, if it's an intelligent take, we welcome it, whether we agree with it or even whether it's calling us out. But as this issue moves forward, abortion, which was already going to be on the radar of the General Assembly in 2023, all of a sudden poised to be the dominant issue yet again. Because if you haven't followed South Carolina politics, the judicial branch in the Palmetto State is not acting independently. It is an extension of the legislature because the legislators appoint the justices. They screen the justices when they're up for re-election. They've got their budget in the back pocket and clearly control most of the rulings that come out of that ostensibly independent judicial branch, but not this one. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. But I do want to point this out. Whatever you think on the issue of abortion, whether you're pro-life, whether you're pro-choice, whether you're somewhere in between, I want to bring this up to all the folks in Republican primaries, Republican primary voters, who listen to these lawmakers come into their districts and campaign on this issue, election after election after election. We're pro-life. We're going to stop these liberal justices. But they do this every election cycle over and over and over. I'm pro-life. They're pro-choice. Vote for me. I'm pro-life. I'll stand up against these liberal judges. No, you won't. You're the ones electing the liberal judges. That's what makes this so ridiculous. So if you're a Republican primary voter, I implore you, the next time one of these Republican lawmakers, these family values, Bible-thumping Republicans comes into your living room, comes on your porch, speaks at one of your Rotary clubs, the next time they tell you, oh, I'm pro-life, these liberal judges, ask them why they voted for those liberal judges. Because again, Republicans, they've been in control of the legislature in this state for nearly a quarter century. Every judge on that Supreme Court, they appointed. They have no one to blame but themselves. So again, whether you're pro-life, whether you're pro-choice, whether you're Republican, whether you're Democrat, know that. Any Republican that comes to you and tells you it's the liberal justices' fault, no, it's their fault for installing those justices in the first place. All right, so we're going to switch gears in this next segment. I've been ranting maniacal about political matters. I'm now going to rant maniacal about Cheer Inc. I think it's this blue blazer I'm wearing that just makes me feel like I'm entitled to. We talked about entitlement earlier. I feel like this blazer makes me entitled.
It's a cigar.
That's it. It's this delicious Dominican. Yeah, that's why I'm entitled to rant. I have a cigar in my pocket. That was from New Year's. I don't smoke cigars. I may have smoked a cigar. I'm sorry. That's like Bill Clinton or Charlie Murphy. That was a Bill Clinton / Charlie Murphy move. Moving on to this wonderful segment. I want to talk about Cheer Inc. because there were some important developments over the last week in this story that we've been following by ourselves, basically, for the last 6 months. And it's important because I kept waiting when we broke this story back in late August. I kept waiting for the national mainstream media just to pile on. And I felt it was going to be just like the Murdoch story. It's like we break it, we drive it, we dominate it, and then the national press kind of comes in and kind of gets their claws in it, which is good. Again, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. We want that to happen. But in this case, we've been out here on an island, basically. And I don't know what's driving that. I don't know whether that's the fact they're complicated cases involving child sex abuse, which again is a difficult thing to talk about and to cover the right way. I don't know whether or not there are financial motivations behind some of the decisions not to cover this story. Some of the corporate interests that have been accused of being part of this conspiracy are very well connected with media outlets, have big, fat advertising budgets. I don't know. Maybe that's got something to do with it. I did find it very interesting. In fact, in one of our Cheer Incorporated podcasts, we talked about this, that the Washington Post, where, democracy dies in something, their bungholes, their dark crevices or something, they had an interview, they did a story on a response to a lawsuit that they didn't even cover. Didn't cover the lawsuit, but covered the response to it, which I think tells you a lot about where the corporate media is on this. But anyway, I'm sure we'll edit out my bunghole comment there. Maybe we won't. I'm in that kind of mood today. I'm in a bunghole kind of mood today. But back to Cheer Inc. We did a big podcast this week. We did several big stories on it this week because there was a story by a guy named Daniel Libet of Sportico. And this is one of the few guys that has been covering this thing right from the very beginning. And in fact, Libet was covering this before we were. He was covering it from when some of the titans of the cheer industry were being accused of antitrust violations, of running an illegal monopoly. He was covering those lawsuits, which, by the way, are still ongoing. But Libet has covered the sex abuse allegations like no other national reporter. And this week, January 3rd, he came out with a story that is, I think it's the best contextual piece written yet about this saga. In fact, I'm very jealous I didn't write it. I will go ahead and admit that. Just a great piece that pulls together all of these stories, all of these narrative threads, and talks about them in the context of competitive cheer looking to gain recognition not only by the International Olympic Committee to possibly be an Olympic sport in 2032. I think that would be the first year it would be eligible, but also recognition by the NCAA, which could happen this year. So two big potential milestones for the cheer industry. And Libet's piece pointed out how they're approaching these milestones at a point of maximum tension. You've got these two huge, legal pincers coming at them, whether it's the antitrust angle or whether it's the child sex abuse lawsuits. But just a great story that put all of it in context, talked about how it was important. And so Dylan Nolan, our director of special projects, Jen Wood, our research director, did an amazing podcast on that. If you haven't listened to it yet, please check out Cheer Incorporated. We're almost done with our first season of that. Just been an amazing offering. So proud of them for the work they've done on that show. But this story by Libet really, it made the case. And in fact, I think as we move forward with this story, as we look to where the cheer industry is headed, don't mistake me. I had no idea about competitive cheer before I started following this. This absolutely should be an Olympic sport. And it absolutely should be an NCAA sport. These are athletes, sensational athletes. They are doing things that I could never do. And it is a sport. It's a sport. Let's call it what it is. And let's give it the recognition that it deserves. But that's not really what this issue is about. The issue is about, as that sport expands its influence, its reach, its visibility, its respect, as it becomes more mainstream, if you will, and more profitable, by the way, to the people who are in charge of it, let's make sure as that happens that the appropriate safeguards are in place, particularly for the child athletes that are participating. Because again, this goes to the very heart of why we've been covering this. It goes to the very heart of why I've been invested in it. And Jen Wood, a cheer mom, whose daughter is a cheerleader, why she's invested in it. And that's because it goes back to, again, what I was talking about in the first segment about future generations. That's what this is about. Are we going to treat our children better than we were treated, better than other generations, but in a way that protects them from the very worst kind of predators? Or, in the case of the cheer industry, are we going to allow those predators free rein? Are we going to allow them to ply these kids with drugs and alcohol and sexualize them, sexually abuse them? That's what this is about, because we can talk about these individual allegations, the graphic allegations. We can talk about those. We can become numb to them because we've heard them over and over and over again. And now a dozen lawsuits, 7 states, 21 survivors, more than 40 defendants named in these lawsuits. We can talk about the numbers and those graphic details all day. But what this case at its core boils down to is, did the industry do its job in protecting these young athletes? Or were the governing bodies that were supposed to be regulating and enforcing child safety, were they part of the problem? And Dylan and Jen did an amazing job in their podcast this week about pointing out in that California case, there's a new California lawsuit. And in that case, one of the gym owners accused of facilitating an environment where this abuse took place, they weren't just named in their capacity as the owner of the gym. That gym owner, Becky Herrera is her name, is one of the governing body regulators. She's one of the members of the U.S. All-Star Federation, which is supposed to be the watchdog. And if that is not a direct line of culpability, again, assuming the allegations made in that lawsuit are accurate, if that's not a direct line of culpability, I don't know what is. And that is what, again, this is about. As this sport makes a name for itself, we have got to make sure that there is an independent, truly independent oversight agency that has one priority: not profits for varsity, not profits for Bain Capital, not profits for all these other wealthy defendants, but the safety and protection of child athletes. All right, that's a wrap for this week's edition of the Week in Review, our first edition of 2023. We hope you'll be here for the 51 to follow. Glad you were here for this one, though. Look out next week. We'll have much more information on our coverage plans for the Murdaugh Murders, Crime, and Corruption, the big double homicide trial, Alec Murdaugh, that is starting on January 23rd. Less than 3 weeks away, folks. We are rapidly approaching a very momentous event in South Carolina history. This is a big deal, one of the biggest trials in the history of the Palmetto State. We've got big plans for it. Can't wait to introduce you to Ashley Meservey. She's going to be our lead anchor producer on this. Can't wait to introduce you to the panel that she's assembling to provide expert analysis of that. Can't wait to show you all the amazing new work that Jen Wood, our research director, and Dylan Nolan, our director of special projects, have cooked up for our coverage. We're committed to covering this story right. Again, FITSNews, tip of the spear on the Murdaughs from the very beginning. We've been driving it ever since. We're going to continue to drive that coverage during the trial as we finally get a verdict on whether or not Alec Murdaugh, the disgraced attorney, murdered his wife and younger son there on their hunting property down in Colleton County a little over a year and a half ago. Count on us to bring you the best coverage of that trial as it begins later this month. But for now, thanks for tuning into the Week in Review. We'll catch you next time.